The emergency session began under the white vaults of the Galactic Security Conclave, where sound carried too cleanly, and reputations died faster than arguments. Tier after tier of delegates watched the central projection swell from a single captured relay node into a dense archive map of human early learning media. The Nursery had seized the relay 12 hours earlier under what they called temporary cognitive quarantine authority. They had expected shipping logs, school routing tags, and language primers. Instead, they found songs. Archivist Sensor Thalek of the Nursery Cognition Bureau stood beside the projection and expanded one file after another with surgical precision. Across the chamber, translated text floated in 9 scripts. Ring around the roses. Rock a bye baby. 3 blind mice. Who killed Cock Robin? There was an old woman who lived in a shoe. In Nursery doctrinal analysis, nothing transmitted to juveniles was casual. Their civilization had been built on directed thought from hatchling stage onward, every story a command scaffold, every rhyme a hierarchy protocol. The underlying paradigm was older than their current star maps. Language existed to shape cognition. Cognition existed to secure obedience. Obedience existed to preserve species continuity. The idea of nonsense for comfort did not fit their framework. Thalek highlighted lexical clusters and threat-coded motifs with cold delight. Predators at thresholds. Structural collapse warnings. Enumerated casualties linked to governance symbols. Escape instructions hidden in repetitive meter. He classified 47% of sampled human nursery rhymes as latent survival doctrine, embedded in juvenile content to bypass hostile sensors and maintain intergenerational resistance capability. The hall shifted in the way large institutions shifted when panic wore formal clothing. Delegates from trade polities exchanged private flashes through table lights. The scholars of Lum dimmed their frills in visible concern. The keepers of Knoll asked for chain of custody verification, received it, and did not ask a second question. Then, High Commander Mitchell entered the well of the chamber, and concern became theater. Mitchell was Nursery aristocracy, distilled into one predatory silhouette, 6-limbed, scaled in obsidian bands with bronze command filigree along his thoracic harness. His species communicated through a blend of speech and psionic overtones. When a senior Nursery addressed a room, listeners with receptive lattices felt the pressure behind each word. He did not shout. He never needed to. Conclave delegates, he said, and the translation lattice rendered his tone as patient contempt. You witness what we have reported for decades and what sentimental powers refused to evaluate. Humanity is not merely undeveloped in cognitive projection, it is structurally fearful. Their juvenile doctrine encodes wolves at doors, collapsing bridges, devouring night creatures, numbered corpses among rulers, and cradle-fall trauma. They are mute-minded primates who encode fear because they cannot project thought. Such species do not become stable peers through courtesy. They become hazards through neglect. He paced once around the projection, claws ticking on stone designed for softer feet. We will therefore establish a protective occupation of human border nurseries, school transports, and educational relays until this fear-mimetic architecture is dismantled. We will secure the children from inherited panic, secure nearby systems from contagion behavior, and secure the conclave from future non-psychic volatility. If humanity complies, this correction ends efficiently. If humanity resists, resistance itself confirms pathological conditioning and justifies expanded trusteeship. A murmur rose and flattened into silence again when Mitchell turned his head toward the human delegation alcove without fully facing it. Take note, he continued. We are extending a civilizing intervention, not conquest. We have no interest in your songs. We are interested in preventing the next species-level stampede triggered by bedtime verse. The irony was so stark that even species with no facial musculature found ways to show it. The merchants of Pax lowered their antennae in disbelief. A Vin wanderer emitted a breath click associated with funerals. The chamber had spent a century calling humans provincial, over-emotional, narratively obsessed. Now, one of the most feared military powers in known space was proposing armed control of human school routes because children had learned about caution through rhyme. Mitchell interpreted the silence as assent. Nexari doctrine gave him reasons. Their fleets had broken coalition after coalition using synchronized fear wave saturation that collapsed enemy command confidence inside minutes. Their admirals did not simply jam channels or target engines. They flooded bridge crews with calibrated dread, fragmented trust, and watched fleets fold without decisive exchange. Every major opponent with centralized command beacons had followed the same arc: agitation, contradiction, paralysis, surrender. A species with no telepathic mesh in Nexari assessment could not maintain coherent resistance against that pressure. Humans, indexed for decades as non-psychic minor power, had therefore occupied a narrow category in Nexari war colleges: noisy, inventive, physically durable, strategically provincial, ultimately manageable. The chamber clerk asked for legal basis citations. Mitchell provided them from memory. Emergency cognitive quarantine precedent, juvenile mimetic hazard clauses, border stabilization annexes. Every statute sat near the edge of lawful interpretation, but each had just enough textual support to force deliberation instead of immediate censure. That was Nexari statecraft at its most polished. Aggression wrapped in procedure until procedure became surrender by another name. 3 rows above, Ambassador Elena Sorensen did not move until the clerk formally recognized the Terran delegation for response scheduling. She was tall, silver-haired at the temples, in a dark diplomatic coat with no ornament beyond a narrow pin bearing the Terran Commonwealth spiral. Her stillness was not passivity. It was measurement. Next to her sat legal attaché Omid Khader, who was already indexing every Nexari citation against conclave protections for civilian transit corridors. On her other side, Commander Ruth Okafor from Civilian Evacuation Command watched the tactical overlays with quiet fury and began sending encrypted notes toward Larkspur traffic control. Even before the debate adjourned, humans in half a dozen systems were receiving revised routing advisories and continuity protocols under routine labels. Across the chamber, the Nexari mistook this administrative calm for shock. By late station cycle, Mitchell's announcement had crossed every major news lattice. The phrase protective occupation trended in 31 languages and was translated with increasingly impolite equivalents by independent commentators. Neutral states asked whether child convoy inspections now counted as legitimate anti-piracy enforcement. Smaller powers asked a simpler question. If the Nexari could declare nursery songs a security threat today, what would stop them from classifying any cultural archive as latent militancy tomorrow? On Luna, in a command suite cut into basalt beneath Tranquility Array, Fleet Admiral Imani Reyes watched the conclave feed replay at quarter speed while logistics maps bloomed over 3 walls. She had commanded anti-raider operations in the Perseus Drift, negotiated militia integration on frontier worlds, and built a reputation for speaking softly while moving tonnage that made senators careful with adjectives. She did not comment until Mitchell reached the line about seizing school transports. "Flag everything labeled educational traffic," she said. "If it moves children, teachers, medics, or curriculum stock, It gets escort options now, not after committee arguments. Her operations chief nodded. Under what authority do we publish? Existing civilian corridor statutes, Reyes said. No emergency rhetoric. No heroic slogans. Quiet competence will do. A junior planner hesitated. Admiral, the Nexari fear wave doctrine is optimized for bridge disruption. Escorts could become liability clusters if command cohesion breaks. Reyes turned to him, not unkindly. Then, we do not run liability clusters. She opened a secure channel to Terran Defense Coordination, where Colonel Mikhail Sokolov and Dr. Elise Navarro waited with a packet-flagged cultural cadence training, childhood retention variant. The file had lived in doctrinal annexes for years, mostly ignored by outsiders because its language looked quaint. Breath pacing, synchronized motor anchors, distributed decision handoffs key to familiar count structures. Inside Terran planning circles, it was known as one more way to keep people functional when fear arrived on schedule. Sokolov gave a clipped update. Border crews on Larkspur, Helion Reach, and Glasswind are already cycling cadence drills. Civilian captains report high compliance. Nobody likes being told to rehearse nursery counts at combat stations, but compliance remains high once they see the psych resilience data. Navarro added, "We are not promising immunity. We are reducing intrusion amplitude and preserving choice under load. The difference between panic and procedure can be 3 seconds." Reyes allowed herself the faintest edge of dry humor. 3 seconds has carried human history farther than most species admit. She approved release of Protocol Lullaby 7 to escort commanders and civilian coordinators with one restriction: no public posting, no triumphant framing, no taunting broadcasts. If the Nexari wanted to read human culture as warfare, humanity would not correct them by speech alone. It would correct them by surviving the first contact intact. Aboard the convoy cutter Resolute Finch in the Larkspur corridor, Lieutenant Commander Hanna Bergman received the protocol package while supervising a mixed manifest of school staff, pediatric clinicians, and modular classroom units bound for outer settlements. Her bridge had 12 crew and 3 volunteer teachers who insisted on helping with drills because, as one of them put it, adults forgot instructions when frightened unless children had already sung them first. Bergman listened to Mitchell's speech once, archived it under threat declarations, and returned to checklists. "Run pattern cards," she told her helmsman. "Playground sequence Alpha through Delta. Rotate con authority every 40 seconds on audible count. If comms jitter, you follow card timing, not your nerves, and not my face." Her executive officer raised an eyebrow. That line should go in every academy textbook. "Put it in crayon if needed," Bergman said. "Just make it legible." In Copenhagen Orbital, Elena Sorensen convened her core team in a narrow conference room lined with acoustic baffles and old Earth maps. She had exactly one window before Nexari patrol elements could claim de facto enforcement presence along human border school routes. One window to define the record before force disguised itself as concern. "We issue warning, not performance," she said. "No outrage language, no cultural apology. We state what those rhymes are, where they came from, and what line cannot be crossed." Cater looked up from his drafting slate. 81 words if we want full relay carried without truncation under emergency protocol." "Then make 81 words do the work of 8,000, Sorensen replied. She walked to the map wall and touched a faded mark over a coastal city, lost centuries earlier in a raid that had entered every school curriculum as a case study in civil continuity planning. Humanity had not built its child lore from abstraction. The songs were compression algorithms for memory: where to gather, who to trust, how to count, when to run, when to hide, how to rebuild, and how to remain human after strangers decided your young were leverage. By the second hour after Mitchell's declaration, Terran systems had shifted into layered readiness that looked mundane from the outside. Transit reroutes, escort pairings, educational packet duplication, militia callbacks under civic disaster statutes, reserve depots unlocking inventory under child protection provisions that had not been activated in living memory. No banners rose, no speeches aired. Warehouses opened, crews reported, and old manuals came off shelves. Sorensen reviewed the final 81 words in silence, then approved transmission to the conclave clerk for formal entry. Outside, station lights moved from afternoon white to evening amber, across docking rings crowded with civilian traffic, now flying under newly assigned guardian tags. When the recall chime summoned delegates back to session, she stood, straightened her coat, and carried the warning to the chamber, while Nexari observers watched with the relaxed confidence of predators who believed the next hour belonged to them. Elena Sorensen stopped at the conclave speaking ring, placed one palm on the declaration rail, and waited for the chamber to settle into formal silence. The white vault amplified tiny sounds as if to shame distraction. A data stylus tapping, a translation node recalibrating, the scrape of an Nexari claw against polished stone. When the clerk gave her the floor, she did not raise her voice. She delivered her warning with the tempo of someone reading coordinates that would later be compared against wreckage. These rhymes are mnemonic shelters, preserving rotes, trust chains, and civil continuity when institutions fail. They are not panic liturgy, but civic memory encoded for children under duress, displacement, and occupation. Any military interference with human nurseries, school transports, or educational relays will be recorded as deliberate assault on protected civilians and answered under standing collective defense doctrine with proportional force and legal consequence. For 300 years, we have been patient. We hoped you would choose dignity. Choose carefully now. No delegate interrupted. The clerk logged the statement, then read back the record tag and timestamp with ceremonial precision. Legal attaché Omid Kader watched his slate confirm archival lock, cross-jurisdiction distribution, and witness certification from 19 observer blocks. The warning could no longer be edited into something safer. Mitchell did not request speaking priority. He overrode it. The telepathic surge struck the chamber like pressure before a storm. Not enough to injure, but enough to remind every receptive species that Nexari rank could force itself into thought space without invitation. Even delegates with low psionic sensitivity stiffened as the translation lattice struggled to keep pace with layered contempt. "Your words are entered," Mitchell said aloud, while the broadcast behind his speech carried sharpened emotional hooks tuned for humiliation. "Your species mistakes ritual noise for doctrine and endurance for strength. Non-psychics cannot coordinate true resistance. You cannot hold coherent command under directed fear. You cannot protect every convoy, every hatchery, every school hull. You will surrender once we quiet your animal panic. We are not choosing between your dignity and our duty. We are choosing order over primitive sentiment." A few allied delegations protested the unauthorized compulsion burst on procedural grounds. The chamber chair issued a reprimand that would have mattered in quieter times. Mitchell accepted it with a dip of the head that was almost elegant and entirely dismissive. Then he made his move. Nexari Operations Control transmitted a corridor bulletin while still under conclave session seal, invoking Emergency Juvenile Stabilization Authority across 3 human border lanes. The language called it temporary guardianship. The enforcement package attached armed inspection cruisers, interception rights over school class transponders, and mandatory cognitive screening for fear mimetic contamination. Every line was legal enough to delay injunction. None of it was lawful in spirit. Commander Ruth Okafor received the bulletin in the human alcove, and went very still. They prepositioned patrol assets before the vote, she said quietly to Sorensen. This was never a threat. It was a schedule. Sorensen nodded once. Send priority amber to Admiral Reyes. Include full text, not summary. Across the chamber, the scholars of Lum requested immediate suspension of enforcement pending independent review. The keepers of Knoll supported. The merchants of Pax demanded insurance guarantees for civilian lanes now entering a declared intervention zone. The motions stacked, procedural lights blinked, and the conclave sank into its favorite failure mode. Immaculate process at the edge of armed seizure. Mitchell watched the confusion with the predator's patience. He had already issued deployment orders. On Luna, Fleet Admiral Imani Reyes read the conclave bulletin beside the recorded warning and did not waste breath on outrage. The crux was operational, not rhetorical. Nexari Command had crossed from analysis to contact, and contact involved children in transit. Transmit Guardian protocol to all escort-eligible hulls, she said. Civilian captains retain right of refusal. We publish risks in plain language. No one gets surprised because we were polite. Her operations chief replied, Nexari jamming risk remains moderate. Fear wave exposure high if they commit cruisers. Reyes looked at the tactical board where Larkspur icons multiplied by the minute. Then we commit crews trained to function frightened. Route the cadence packets again. Push them to every bridge, every shuttle, every school transport pilot, every medic with a flight cert. If someone can count, they can stay in the loop. Dr. Elise Navarro appeared on secure feed with strands of data rolling behind her. Cognitive hardening modules are live. We can boost retention with audible metronome tracks. Familiar rhythms reduce intrusion spikes by 20 to 31% in simulations. Not enough to feel brave, Reyes said. Enough to keep choosing, Navarro answered. Reyes accepted that. In war, choice was the narrowest resource. Back in the conclave, a station aide approached the human alcove with faceplate pale and protocol forgotten. Ambassador, Nexari customs teams have begun boarding procedures in the outer Larkspur relay ring. They are labeling classroom modules for seizure. Cater's jaw tightened. They moved before registry acknowledgement cycle even closed. Sorensen stood. She requested final floor access and received it over scattered objections. Her second statement was shorter, colder, and addressed to record rather than conscience. Humanity has issued warning under conclave law. Nexari forces are now in active interference with protected civilian educational traffic. We are invoking collective self-defense on child corridor statutes and allied witness provisions. This is notice of response, not request for permission. Mitchell gave her a thin smile that did not reach his eyes. You will discover the difference between declaration and capability. Sorensen met his stare with diplomatic stillness that had outlived younger empires. You are about to discover the difference between patience and surrender. 40 minutes later, as Conclave security tried and failed to restore procedural control, Terran Civilian Evacuation Command shifted from amber to crimson protective status. Escort cutters detached from customs lanes. Militia contracts long filed under disaster readiness activated in 12 systems. Reserve depots released hardened comms kits tagged for school traffic. None of it looked dramatic on public feed. It looked administrative, almost dull. Ships were fueled. Rosters were confirmed. Children were moved by schedule, not by panic. On the Resolute Finch, Lieutenant Commander Hannah Bergman strapped into command and patched convoy-wide audio. Larkspur Group, this is Finch Actual. We are now under active interception threat. We execute playground pattern alpha on my count and rotate con authority every 40 seconds regardless of rank. If you lose me, follow the card. If you feel fear spike, breathe on cadence and keep your hands moving through trained tasks. We do not improvise courage today. We execute procedure. A teacher on Transport Willow class responded first. Copy Finch. Classroom team has count tracks loaded. A pediatric medic on Mercy Kite added, if anyone needs a voice in the channel, our nurses can run metered cues. Bergman allowed herself one dry exhale. Never thought battlefield rhythm support would come from pediatric nursing. But here we are. Keep channels clean and sing if it keeps your hands steady. The convoy cleared Relay Shadow and entered the long, blue-black stretch of the Larkspur corridor, where freight routes narrowed between gravity shear ridges and old mining debris. That was where Nexari interception doctrine liked to operate. Limited vectors, high stress, easy intimidation. At the corridor's far mouth, Nexari strike coordinator Varesh Tel observed the incoming human group from the command cradle of Cruiser 73rd Ascendancy. He was younger than his title suggested, elevated quickly after a campaign against the coalition of Drax, where 3 enemy flotillas had collapsed under synchronized fear wave pulses without firing a coordinated broadside. His confidence rested on data, precedent, and species hierarchy. Signal package prepared, his tactical adepts reported. Broad-spectrum dread harmonics calibrated for non-psychic bridge crews. Predicted command fracture in 118 seconds. Vareshtel flexed his forelimbs against the cradle restraints and watched the human formation. It looked wrong already. Not militarily aggressive, not desperate, just oddly patterned. Civilian transports, clinic craft, and 2 cutters shifting vectors in offset triangles as if following playground markings visible only to them. Primitive convoy behavior, one aide said with contempt. They cannot hold formation discipline. Vareshtel clicked assent. Initiate compulsion wave. Begin with command-targeted anxiety spikes. We will accept surrender beacons in sequence by vessel mass. The first psychic pulse crossed the gap like a pressure wall. On most fronts, it would have cracked bridge coherence fast, turning officers against their own judgment before they could name what they felt. On Finch, Hannah Bergman tasted metallic fear and heard her own pulse in her ears, but the metronome tone in her headset held steady. Left hand tapped rail. Right hand confirmed thrust adjustment. Breath in for 4 counts, out for 4. She did not wait to feel calm. Alpha 1. Pivot 2 degrees starboard on beat 3, she said. Con to Petty Officer Ibarra at mark. Ibarra took command exactly on cue, voice clipped and unshaken. Executing. Beta pair, drift -6. Keep spacing, keep count. Across the convoy, authority shifted again and again, never long enough for a single bridge mine to become a decisive vulnerability. Teachers counted softly over local channels. Nurses echoed numbers. A cargo pilot with no military background matched thrust to a rhyme she had learned at 6 years old and had mocked at 16. Under the pressure wave, mockery had no value. Muscle memory did. Vareshtel frowned as tactical readouts refused their expected cascade. Heart rate spikes appeared, yes. Fear biomarkers rose, yes. But command signals did not fragment into noise. They redistributed. Recalibrate, he snapped. Increase amplitude. Target lead cutter executive layer. Second pulse, third pulse. Human formation bent, broke, and then reassembled on new axes with almost musical regularity. By Nexari metrics, they should have been incoherent. Instead, they became difficult to predict. Why are subordinate signatures issuing valid course authority? An aide asked, unsettled. Because their hierarchy has failed. Another replied too quickly. Vareshtel studied the pattern and felt the first cold thread of uncertainty. Failed hierarchies did not produce this kind of coordinated drift. This was not collapse. It was planned decentralization. Then the escort cutter Quiet Harbor peeled away and feigned propulsion damage, venting a narrow trail of coolant that glittered like panic to Nexari threat models. Vereshtel took the bait and sent 2 frigates to isolate it for boarding. As they committed, hidden human drones unlatched from convoy blind spots and fanned outward in a thin curtain. They were not armed heavily enough to kill a cruiser. They were precise enough to blind one. Point defense saturation, Vereshtel ordered. Too late. The drones flashed directional bursts at sensor clusters, then dumped reflective chaff tuned to Nexari targeting wavelengths. His 2 frigates vanished from clean lock for 8 seconds. 8 seconds in a corridor where vector math punished hesitation. On Finch, Petty Officer Ibarra handed Khan to Ensign Malik exactly at the mark. Malik's voice stayed almost polite. Playground pattern Gamma, mark the gap. Mark the gap. There. Human cutters surged through the opening, not to ram or annihilate, but to split the Nexari squadron into isolated pairs with obstructed line of psychic support. Kinetic lances fired in disciplined sequence, punching propulsion rings and weapon mounts, avoiding life support cores. One Nexari frigate spun powerless. Another lost maneuvering and drifted into magnetic tow nets launched by a civilian tug that had pretended to be dead weight. Vereshtel stared at his tactical sphere as red icons turned amber for disabled rather than black for destroyed. The humans were choosing incapacitation under combat stress. That was tactically inconvenient and strategically insulting. Boarding teams report hull contact on frigate Talon 7, an aide said, disbelief leaking through formal tone. Human Marines are cutting through external lock collars. Repel them, Vereshtel hissed. We cannot synchronize repulsion burst. Mesh latency has increased. It had increased because the human convoy kept forcing local command handoffs faster than Nexari fear wave doctrine could pin a stable target. Every time Vereshtel focused pressure on one bridge, authority moved. Every time he sought a flagship node, signatures flattened into distributed control. It was like trying to strangle water. A clipped human transmission bled onto an open channel, probably by accident, maybe not. Apparently the monsters under the bed filed no flight plan. Laughter did not follow. Human comm discipline remained rigid. But the line traveled across Nexari monitors and landed like a private joke told during a funeral. 3 minutes into what should have been a clean psychological suppression action, Vereshtel's squadron had 2 disabled frigates, 1 boarded hull, and a convoy still moving children out of reach. He requested reinforcement with language carefully chosen to avoid the word miscalculation. At the Narrows command lattice, Nexari strategic analysts began flagging a new annotation beside human civilian doctrine entries. Repetitive juvenile cadence, distributed authority, fear wave attenuation through synchronized motor rhythm, potentially intentional. In the conclave chamber, live combat overlays lit above the delegates, while arguments about legal interpretation died on contact with evidence. The first Nexari boarding attempt had failed. Human civilians had not scattered. They had maneuvered. Elena Sorensen watched the feed from the same rail where she had delivered 81 words and sent 1 encrypted message to Admiral Reyes. Record now shows capacity and intent. We continue. On Luna, Reyes read it, glanced once at the expanding map of convoy lanes, and issued the order she had prepared before Mitchell ever finished his speech. Phase 2 escorts. Execute Lullaby 7 across all threatened corridors. We are done asking whether they will stop. The order moved through Terran networks as a plain logistics packet, which was exactly why it arrived faster than any declaration. In Helion Reach, dockmasters unlocked hardened comm kits, stamped for educational transit, and passed them to shuttle pilots who had never worn uniforms. In Glasswind, reserve cutters detached from customs piers and fell into position beside school barges carrying teachers, portable clinics, and food printers. In Larkspur, Hannah Bergman watched fresh escort icons bloom on her tactical display and understood that humanity had crossed from local resistance to coordinated doctrine without changing tone, volume, or posture. On Finch, the metronome in every headset clicked at the same conservative tempo, while the convoy threaded debris and gravity shear. Bergman shifted con again, 40 seconds on the mark, and listened to a chorus of confirmations from voices that sounded like routine traffic control. Mercy Kite, count established. Willow class, breathing cadence stable. Quiet Harbor, tow nets reloaded, we are uglier than we look. Bergman answered with dry restraint. You are all beautiful in very specific regulatory ways. Keep your vectors clean. The first surprise was not that humans fought back. Nursery planners had expected stubbornness, perhaps even heroic waste. The surprise was that fear stopped being centrally useful. Every pulse Faresh Tel launched still raised stress markers. Palms still sweated. Heart rate still climbed. But command decisions no longer collapsed around frightened individuals because individual authority had already been fragmented by design into pre-briefed loops tied to count, motion, and task. The convoy did not wait to feel calm. It functioned on cadence until calm became irrelevant. At Luna Command, Dr. Elise Navarro watched live neurotelemetry from volunteer crews who had opted into shared monitoring. She spoke to Reyes without looking away from the curves. Amplitude spikes are real. No miracle here, but intrusive persistence drops when the rhythm lock holds beyond 12 seconds. Their compulsion profile needs sustained cognitive occupancy to cascade. We keep breaking occupancy. Colonel Mikhail Sokolov folded his hands behind his back as if he were at a lecture instead of a live engagement. So they can still scare us. Navarro nodded. They can scare us very effectively. They are discovering that fear and obedience are different variables. Reyes gave one short answer. Publish that to every escort captain exactly like that. No mythology. In the conclave chamber, where procedural law had pretended to outrun war for most of the day, the tactical projection now forced delegates to witness detail. Nursery fear wave strength registered at levels that had shattered prior coalitions. Human biometric distress registered in parallel. Yet convoys continued to maneuver in coherent blocks that changed lead authority like passing a baton through smoke. Delegates from small border polities began querying emergency access to Terran civil continuity manuals. The chamber clerk denied release pending treaty permissions, then quietly sent a legal request to the Terran alcove asking whether exemplar excerpts could be shared under witness protocols. Omid Kader saw the request, glanced at Sorensen, and waited. She kept her eyes on the projection where another school transport slid through an interception arc by 3 ship lengths and replied, "Approved in principle. Redact route-sensitive details. Keep the ethics section intact." Kader blinked once. The ethics section? Yes, Sorensen said. Procedure without ethics is just efficient cruelty. At the Narrows command lattice, Nursery analysts replayed Larkspur from 6 sensor perspectives and hated every frame. Their models showed 2 conclusions that contradicted doctrine. First, human resistance coherence increased under moderate fear exposure if cadence networks remained unbroken. Second, attempts to decapitate human command by targeting senior officers produced marginal effect because tactical authority migrated downward in less time than a Nursery pulse cycle. A senior theoretician, old enough to remember campaigns before synchronized compulsion became sacred, requested permission to classify human convoy behavior as distributed anti-psionic architecture rather than primitive improvisation. The request sat unanswered for 11 minutes, then was returned with one correction from Mitchell's office. Do not validate adversary mythology. Reclassify as stochastic resistance artifact, pending suppression. Theoretician Iral Keth read the note and felt the floor move beneath his certainty. Stochastic artifact did not board frigates with disciplined Marines while maintaining civilian spacing standards. Stochastic artifact did not preserve non-lethal targeting profiles under compulsion load. He archived his objection in a private cache he had never before needed. By the time the first hour of Phase 2 ended, 4 additional corridors had reported attempted Nexari interdiction, and none had produced a mass civilian surrender. In Helion Reach, a Nexari cruiser forced an inspection halt against a line of education barges and launched a harmonized dreadburst calibrated for mixed-species crews. The barges shuddered, drifted, then snapped into an alternating spiral pattern keyed to a simple hand clap sequence piped through local audio. Authority rotated from captain to quartermaster to engine chief in 30-second steps, while escort cutters targeted thruster clusters and comm arrays instead of reactor cores. The cruiser lost maneuvering and transmitted formal protest while drifting under tow lock. The barges resumed schedule 14 minutes late, which the Terran Transit Office marked as unacceptable but survivable. In glass wind, Nexari boarding teams landed on a clinic carrier and discovered the outer corridors already segmented by emergency bulkheads and floor lights flashing in meter. Every hatch code was embedded in count cadence, and every crew member answered status checks with clipped numeric strings that doubled as respiratory pacing. A boarding lieutenant attempted localized compulsion against the bridge medic supervising internal traffic and received a calm reply over open channel. I hear you. I decline you. We are on 6s today. 2 minutes later, the boarding team was disarmed by station security auxiliaries who had practiced the same drill during wildfire evacuations 3 years earlier. Nexari field reports began using words no officer wanted attached to a first contact suppression campaign. Resistant, adaptive, layered, preconditioned. Vereshtel, still in command at Larkspur and now nursing both damaged hulls and damaged Pride, opened a priority line to Nexari Sector Command. Request doctrinal clarification, he said, voice controlled by force of habit. Current compulsion sequencing produces degraded outcomes against human juvenile traffic formations, employing distributed authority transfer and rhythmic cognitive anchoring. Recommend immediate update to engagement protocols before further attrition. The response came from a staff adjutant, not from Mitchell. High Command notes your concerns. Increase pressure. Humans are near threshold. Their coherence is performative and temporary. Vereshtel stared at his tactical sphere where another human convoy slipped his interdiction cone by aligning thrust changes to an audible count picked up on passive sensors. With respect, this is not near-threshold behavior. Your respect is noted, the adjutant said, then cut the channel. He sat in silence for 3 breaths, then gave orders no Nexari officer expected to give against non-psychic civilians. Reconfigure interceptor spacing. Do not chase decoy coolant trails. Prioritize mesh integrity over direct boarding. We regroup before the next pulse. One of his aides hesitated. Regrouping will appear weak in report. So will losing another frigate to a school convoy, Vereshtel said. On Luna, Reyes received consolidated corridor data and watched the trend line tilt from defensive survival toward operational initiative. The shift was slight, fragile, and real. She opened a secure channel to Bergman. Finch Actual, this is Reyes. Your corridor actions are now doctrinal reference. You are authorized to transmit practical notes to other convoy leads. Keep them plain. Keep them honest. Bergman's reply came with background noise of alerts and counting voices. Understood, Admiral. Practical Note 1. Fear still arrives. Practical Note 2. Count anyway. Practical Note 3. When in doubt, hand con to whoever can breathe and read the card. Reyes let herself almost smile. Approved for circulation. The second surprise from the Nexari perspective was morale rather than technical. Human fire discipline remained controlled even where Nexari crews expected revenge. Disabled ships were boarded and secured, not vaporized. Life support was preserved. Surrender vectors were acknowledged without theatrical humiliation. This did not read as weakness anymore. It read as confidence with time to spare. Species that were truly desperate did not spend munitions on precision when annihilation was easier. In the conclave, delegates began speaking in terms they had avoided for decades. The Keepers of Null formally entered a motion to suspend Nexari Juvenile Stabilization Authority pending independent war risk review. The Scholars of Lum endorsed Terran interpretation of mnemonic archives as protected cultural continuity systems. The Merchants of Pax, practical above all ideologies, announced temporary rerouting of insurance guarantees away from Nexari-claimed inspection lanes and toward human-escorted corridors. Markets moved before diplomacy did. Diplomacy noticed. Mitchell requested emergency speaking access and received it. His image rose above the chamber, immaculate, despite the first visible attrition in his perimeter fleets. When he spoke, his contempt had acquired a harder edge. Delegates are misreading tactical noise as strategic reversal. Human vessels are exhibiting conditioned panic management, not parity. Nexari enforcement remains lawful, necessary, and ongoing. Any polity interfering with stabilization operations will be considered complicit in mimetic endangerment of juveniles across shared lanes. Sorensen listened, then asked for immediate rebuttal. Her answer was short enough to fit beneath his threat and sharp enough to endure after it. Lawful authority does not board school hulls at Lance Point. Stabilization does not target medevac crews with compulsion bursts. The record now contains your methods and your results. The galaxy can judge both. Mitchell did not respond to her directly. He turned his gaze toward the chamber tiers where neutral blocks sat undecided and said, "Judge quickly. History has little patience for species that mistake sentiment for security." If he had hoped to recover initiative through intimidation, the effect was mixed. Some delegates recoiled, but not toward him. Others simply watched the live overlays where his doctrine kept failing in front of school transports that continued to move on schedule. In Nexari command circles, internal conflict ceased being theoretical. High-ranking strategists split into two camps over hours. One argued for overwhelming escalation, saturating entire corridors with compounded fear fields and accepting civilian losses as regrettable proof of necessary order. The other, smaller and growing, argued that escalation against children had already detonated political legitimacy across the conclave, and that continued pressure would trigger broader coalition intervention under statutes even Nexari lawyers could not fully bend. Iral Keth, the old theoretician, was summoned into a closed tactical consultation with Mitchell's inner staff. The room was windowless, shielded, and thick with unspoken blame. A younger commander opened with accusation disguised as inquiry. "You reviewed human culture archives during early contact phases. Why were these rhythmic resistance architectures not elevated to strategic threat status?" Iral Keth answered without deference. "Because our review criteria filtered juvenile content as low military relevance unless tied to explicit command phrases. We did not merely miss data. We dismissed an entire category because it violated our assumptions about what intelligence looks like." Another officer snapped, "They are using songs." "Yes," Iral Keth said, "and we are losing ships to them." Mitchell had been silent until then, claws resting on the table edge. clarify the mechanism in operational terms. Iralkath met his stare. Their rhythms are not weapons. They are scaffolds. We shaped doctrine around forcing emotional states to break centralized cognition. Humans are distributing cognition across bodies, tasks, and timed handoffs. You compel one mind and receive 5 replacements. We call that primitive because it is old. Old does not mean weak. Mitchell's jaw tightened. Then we cut deeper. Target infrastructure feeding their rhythm distribution. Educational relays? Iralkath asked, and did not hide the contempt in his own voice now. You are already doing that. It has unified every faction they possess. Silence followed, heavy and dangerous. Speaking plain truth to Nursery Command was often a career-ending event. Today, reality had already ended careers in space. Mitchell dismissed the room in staggered waves until only his core operations cell remained. When he finally spoke, his decision carried both calculation and fury. Regroup all corridor enforcement into layered kill boxes at the Narrows of Kelt. No more dispersed attrition. We force decisive engagement on terrain favorable to harmonic dominance and lane control. Pull damaged assets to rear refit. Replace field coordinators who report doctrinal defeatism. Prepare public line. Strategic consolidation for civilian safety. One aide asked carefully, and the conclave scrutiny. Mitchell's answer was ice. Conclave scrutiny cannot seize a hyperlane. Fleet mass can. Orders propagated at once. Nursery patrol elements withdrew from some outer interception points, not from restraint but to concentrate force, where they believed humans would be compelled to pass. The withdrawals were framed as de-escalation by official channels and recognized as consolidation by anyone who could read movement patterns. At Larkspur, Vareshtel received reassignment with clipped formality. His remaining ships were folded into the Kelt grouping. He studied the transfer packet, then watched a final human school convoy exit his corridor under escort, running the same patient count through open comms as if this day were a difficult drill rather than a war. One of his junior tacticians spoke before fear-advised silence. Coordinator, did we misunderstand them from the beginning? Vareshtel kept his eyes on the fading icons. We misunderstood the cost of treating memory as weakness. He closed the channel, turned toward the new vector line to Kelt, and began rebuilding his formation around an offensive he no longer believed would be simple. The transfer corridor to Kelt had barely closed behind Vareshtel's task group when Luna Command marked the Nursery withdrawals for what they were and stripped the last diplomatic euphemisms from planning boards. Fleet Admiral Imani Reyes stood at the center rail while vector lines redrew themselves in hard angles toward the Narrows, and every officer in the room understood the same underlying calculation. Mitchell had stopped trying to manage optics in 5 places at once. He was assembling a hammer. Consolidation confirmed, operations said. Outer inspections dropping by 42%. Heavy units and psionic cruisers massing at Kelt anchorage rings. Reyes nodded. Then, we stopped treating corridor actions as isolated rescues. Execute archive lattice. Around the room, a few newer analysts glanced up at the term. Colonel Mikhail Sokolov answered for them without turning from his console. You are now seeing the part outsiders never bothered to read. Archive Lattice had lived under civil defense authorities for 2 generations and was funded so quietly that 3 budget committees had once misfiled it as education interoperability. Its premise was brutally simple. If command towers fell, if long-range comms jammed, if cities fragmented, decision authority had to survive in forms hostile occupiers would ignore until too late. Nursery lines, festival counts, school percussion drills, and old evacuation songs were indexed into an operations tree that mapped tasks by cadence, not by vulnerable central beacon. One line changed routing. 2 lines reassigned escort priority. A repeated refrain triggered militia logistics release. No node knew everything. Every node knew enough. Dr. Elise Navarro pushed a transparent overlay into the main display. Colored threads unfolded across 6 systems, linking convoy captains, municipal dispatchers, tug unions, orbital clinics, freight cooperatives, and reserve cutters through what looked to Nursery signal analysts like absurdly redundant civilian chatter. Cognitive hardening kept people functional, she said. This keeps whole societies coherent. They can blind a flagship and terrify a bridge crew. They cannot decapitate a structure that has no single head. Reyes authorized release of lattice fragments to corridor commanders with one unambiguous instruction. No improvisational heroics. Follow branch logic. Preserve civilians first. Always. At the Narrows of Kelt, the first indications reached Mitchell as statistical irritants rather than alarms. Human traffic still entered his engagement envelope in uneven pulses, yet ships that should have clogged his interception grids arrived with precise spacing. Damaged civilian cutters that ought to have diverted to nearest docks instead routed toward specific secondary stations where repair gantries had been powered in advance. Terran escort groups that appeared detached rejoined exactly where Nursery pickets had thinned moments earlier, as if the humans had read orders not yet issued. Mitchell demanded source attribution. His intelligence cell returned a stack of intercepts filled with children's count phrases, maintenance acknowledgments, weather checks, and dull municipal code strings. He flicked his claws against the projection. You are telling me this nonsense predicts tactical movement. Iral Kath, pulled into command analysis despite earlier friction, answered with a fatigue that sounded like clarity. It does more than predict movement. It carries delegated authority and logistics intent simultaneously. We keep seeking command declarations. They are transmitting decision trees in plain view. Mitchell's gaze sharpened. Then break the channels. We are trying, Iralketh said. There are too many channels, and most are legitimate civilian infrastructure. If we jam comprehensively, we collapse the very transit lattice you claim to be stabilizing. The conclave feed is still live. For a long moment, Mitchell said nothing. The tactical truth had become politically corrosive. Every Nursery countermove now required either operational concession or open admission that his doctrine depended on striking civilian systems he had sworn to protect. In the conclave chamber, where fatigue had made tempers brittle and language exact, Omid Cotter placed the first verified archive lattice brief on the clerk's rail under witness seal. He did not reveal branch keys, route specifics, or security triggers. He revealed enough. These materials establish that Terran juvenile cultural media includes lawful civil continuity encoding developed during historical occupation and famine periods, he said. They are protective archives, not expansion doctrine. Their current activation correlates with documented Nursery interdiction of school and medical traffic. Delegates who had dismissed earlier claims as rhetorical saw the cross-referenced evidence and stopped pretending uncertainty was neutral. The scholars of Lum filed formal support within 3 minutes. The keepers of Knoll requested emergency codification of educational routes as protected corridors under collective observation. Even blocks that disliked Terran influence recognized the precedent stalking them. If cultural memory could be criminalized whenever a stronger fleet needed pretext, no archive in the chamber was safe. By the end of the same station cycle, the merchants of Pax quietly transferred convoy insurance instruments to a Terran-led escrow pool and stopped underwriting Nursery inspection claims altogether. The balance of power did not swing in one dramatic arc. It shifted in measurable increments. Nexari interdictions produced fewer captures. Human convoy survivability climbed. Neutral escorts began accepting Terran procedural packets. Most dangerous for Mitchell, fear wave exposure no longer guaranteed command disintegration, which meant every engagement now consumed Nexari hulls in exchanges his staff had budgeted as near bloodless. On Resolute Finch, Hannah Bergman received her Archive Lattice branch card in a sealed tactical update while overseeing refuel under combat watch. She scanned the plain language instructions once, then handed copies to her executive officer and civilian liaison. "Branch Sparrow Blue," she said. "If corridor comms fracture, teachers become timing officers for local clusters, medics hold welfare triage authority, and tugs inherit extraction sequencing. We keep escort guns where they buy time, not pride." Her executive officer let out a short breath. "We are assigning maneuver authority to kindergarten staff." "We are assigning survival authority to people who already coordinate frightened groups under pressure," Bergman replied. "Titles are decorative. Competence is not." Across nearby channels, that logic repeated in different accents. Mining supervisors accepted temporary navigation control when convoy pilots rotated out under psychic strain. School administrators ran cadence clocks for mixed-species refugees packed into transport bays. Nurses called count on short final approaches through debris, where one missed beat could kill thrust alignment. The work looked ordinary from the outside and was therefore resilient. Reyes addressed the expanding defense network in a transmission carried across military bands, civilian channels, and Allied observer relays. Her tone held no theatrics, only a deliberate gravity that left no room for misreading. For 300 years, we built a society that treated child safety as civilization's baseline test. That was not sentiment. It was strategic memory. We remembered raiders, quarantines, famines, and occupations, and we encoded continuity where no sensor could cleanly excise it. Today, you are proving those systems under fire. You are not fighting for revenge. You are fighting so school ships arrive, so clinics dock, so frightened people can still choose each next action. Hold cadence. Protect one another. Keep discipline. Let those who threaten children learn what patience was preparing. The speech was replayed in docking rings and bridge compartments where crew members sat shaking after fear wave contact and went back to work anyway. Nexari fear did not arrive as panic. It arrived as unwelcome pattern recognition. Vereshtel felt it first when his reassigned squadron reached Kelt, and he saw Mitchell's fortress geometry failing to produce the compliance curves every academy had promised. Human movements through the Narrows were no longer reactive. They were probing his perimeter in controlled, non-committal strokes, forcing his line to expose reinforcement priorities while never offering a central node for psychic decapitation. One of his analysts pulled up comparative data and said the quiet part aloud. "Coordinator, they are making us reveal ourselves one branch at a time." Vereshtel watched a civilian Tug feign drift, draw a Corvette pair 2 degrees off lane, and clear passage for a school convoy behind it with such practiced timing that he could not call it luck, even to comfort himself. Then, "Stop giving them easy branches," he said. But the order carried little confidence because he no longer believed easy branches existed. What made humans formidable was no longer abstract to Nexari crews. It was the refusal to let fear define agency. It was the cultural instinct to convert memory into procedure and procedure into collective action. It was a species willing to place lawyers, pilots, teachers, medics, and Marines inside one ethical frame and call all of them defenders without irony. At Copenhagen Orbital, Sørensen met with delegations from Lum, Knoll, and Pax in a secure side chamber while combat feeds flickered silently over the wall. They asked for Terran anti-coercion training access, convoy coordination templates, and legal language, durable enough to survive future pretexts by stronger powers. She agreed in principle and tied every concession to one condition. Civilian protection cannot be selective, she said. If this framework applies only when your own young are threatened, it is not law. It is tribal preference in formal attire. A LUM representative lowered its frills in assent. You are asking us to accept intervention triggers that could restrain us later. Yes, Sorensen said. That is what rules are for. In Luna's lower command ring, Sokolov reviewed militia integration statuses and noticed an unexpected pattern among volunteers. Enrollment spikes came not from veteran enclaves first, but from municipal service unions, school maintenance crews, and public transit operators. People used to keeping systems running under stress had stepped into defense roles with minimal rhetoric and high reliability. He sent the data to Reyes with one line. Our reserve depth is civic, not just military. She sent back a single word. Exactly. The turning point arrived when three developments converged within less than an hour. First, Conclave legal staff accepted emergency observer deployment to Kelt under joint authority, stripping Mitchell of plausible secrecy. Second, Pax insurers publicly voided all Nursery protective seizure indemnities, making every further boarding action a self-financed political liability. Third, Terran archive lattice nodes synchronized across Kelt approach lanes and began routing traffic and escorts in layered waves that Nursery targeting software, built for centralized fleets, parsed too slowly. Mitchell attempted to recover initiative with a broad warning to the chamber, this time voice only. Telepathic pressure carefully muted under scrutiny. Any concentration of Terran warships within Kelt sovereign enforcement perimeter will be met as escalation. Withdraw and submit route inspections or accept full harmonized suppression. Sorensen did not answer him. Reyes did. Her image appeared on the conclave projection from Luna Command, uniform plain, expression carved from restraint. Hi, Commander. Your forces attacked protected school and medical traffic after formal warning and legal notice. You claimed guardianship while boarding children at Lance Point. That record is closed. Human defensive concentrations will proceed under civilian corridor statutes and witness oversight. You may disengage now and preserve lives, or persist and lose your fleet. The choice remains yours. The consequences are no longer uncertain. Mitchell cut the channel without acknowledgement. At Kelt, Nursery batteries powered to full. Psionic cruisers locked into harmonic arrays around the Narrow's throat. Minefields seeded with compulsion amplifiers brightened on tactical screens like a net tightening over deep water. Mitchell had built his execution ground and intended to use it. Human formations answered by assembling just outside the choke in patterns that looked fragmented until one watched long enough to see the cadence. Escort cutters, reserve frigates, civilian tugs, militia corvettes, hospital ships, and drone screens settled into staggered layers tied to archive branches that redistributed authority faster than Nursery pulses could pin it. Behind them, heavier Commonwealth task forces emerged from dark transit windows in disciplined silence, their hulls carrying no triumphant banners, only registry marks and child corridor protection designations. Conclave observer beacons took station above the field and began broadcasting every emission to the galaxy in real time. Reyes stood at her rail as the final readiness checks completed and sent one narrowband message to every human and allied vessel in theater. Count steady. Hold the line. We end this at Kelt. Across the Narrows, Mitchell's fortress guns turned, and the first warning tones rose through both fleets as the confrontation he had demanded finally began. Nursery fortress batteries fired first. Long violet lances crossing the Narrows in disciplined salvos, meant to herd human hulls into harmonic kill lanes. At the same moment, Mitchell's psionic cruisers released a coordinated fear surge broad enough to wash over military decks and civilian bridges alike. On the Terran flagship bastion line, palms tightened around rails, breathing hitched, and old instincts screamed to scatter. Reyes did not ask anyone to feel fearless. All groups, execute Lantern Veil, decoy emotions on my mark. Civilians maintain Sparrow Blue Authority loops. Combat elements hold fire until cadence call. We are not here to prove courage. We are here to end predation. Dr. Elise Navarro fed the fleet-wide countermeasure from Luna's cognitive operations node. Human ships began broadcasting deliberately contradictory emotional signatures, panic spikes without vector drift, anger bursts from hospital hulls that never armed weapons, calm bands from militia corvettes already accelerating into risk. Nexari classifiers trained to map emotion to intent started sorting ghosts. Mitchell saw the telemetry distortion and dismissed it as noise. Compel through. Focus on command-capable tonnage. Collapse their escorts and the civilian shells will strand. Iral Keth, one station below him on the flagship Sovereign Clarity, watched the readouts with quiet dread. High Commander, they are baiting our harmonics into fixed channels. If we keep pressing at this amplitude, we expose our resonance envelope. Mitchell's jaw set. Press harder. The next fear wave crest rolled out, sharper and narrower. That was the trigger Navarro had predicted. Human drone curtains, previously drifting as harmless interference, unfolded in precise arcs across the throat of Kelt. Each drone released inertial mines no larger than cargo canisters, dark, cold, and nearly invisible against the lane clutter. They did not arm on proximity. They armed on Nexari harmonic signatures, waiting for the exact psionic frequency profile Mitchell's cruisers had just amplified. On the Bastion line, Tactical Commander Priya Nadim spoke the count into every military and civilian channel with the measured cadence of a classroom drill. Hands ready. 2 beats. 3 beats. Clap count on 4. Across hundreds of ships, crews tapped console edges. Gloves, rails, flight yokes. 4 dry beats traveled the network, absurdly simple and perfectly synchronized. Human formations snapped from apparent fragmentation into converging geometry. Kinetic lances opened fire. They struck escort rings around Nexari command hulls in mathematically cruel sequence. Propulsion clusters, maneuver fins, weapon articulation joints, comm spines. No reactor punctures, no life support breaches. Ships died as war machines and remained alive as habitats. In less than 30 seconds, Mitchell's outer shield of cruisers became a cloud of spinning, powerless metal with emergency lights still burning. At 9 minutes into the exchange, Conclave observer beacons rebroadcast the tactical feed, unedited, to every registered polity. Varesh Tel, commanding a battered wing on the Nexari left, tried to reform around a surviving harmonics cruiser and found his channels corrupted by his own doctrine. Human cyber units had penetrated relay stacks during the first sensor flare and now looped Mitchell's earlier speeches through command nets at full priority. You cannot coordinate true resistance. You will surrender once we quiet your animal panic. Order over primitive sentiment. The recorded boasts repeated over-targeting prompts, over-damage reports, over-distress calls. Crews fought their own comm discipline, while human strike groups crossed the gap. Purge the channels, Vareshtel ordered. His communications officer replied with strained disbelief. We purge 1 node and it reappears 3 nodes deeper. They mapped our redundancy. He understood then that the battle was no longer a contest of intimidation. It was systematic dismantling. Reyes watched the Nexari line begin to buckle and issued the message she had held in reserve, broadcasting on military bands and open emergency frequencies alike. For 300 years, We were told patience was weakness and restraint was an invitation. We documented every raid, every seizure dressed as policy, every child convoy forced to fly under another species' guns. We asked for law. We gave warning. You answered with occupation orders and compulsion bursts against school ships. Hear this clearly. Humanity does not confuse mercy with surrender. We will disable every vessel that continues this attack. We will board every command that refuses lawful cessation, and we will preserve every life that stands down. Choose now. Disengage and live under judgment, or persist and lose the capacity to threaten anyone again. We hoped you would choose dignity. You chose poorly. Mitchell cut across her broadcast with a direct fleet command. No surrender vectors. Full harmonized suppression. Break them. He never got the full order executed. The drone mines armed in cascading sequence as his cruisers pushed one more psionic surge. Mines flared with compact, gravitational kicks that sheared harmonics arrays out of alignment and shoved heavy hulls into one another at low but crippling differential velocity. The Narrows filled with tumbling Nexari ships, intact crews trapped inside disabled steel. Human strike elements flowed through the chaos on the same clap count cadence, adjusting vectors faster than Nexari fire control could solve. Cutter groups screened school and medical transports behind armored wedges. Reserve frigates cut off retreat lanes without closing for kills. Militia corvettes, dismissed for years as provincial auxiliaries, held lane edges with disciplined fire that denied regrouping attempts. What looked improvised to hostile analysts resolved up close into layered doctrine. Then, Luna's cybercell completed the second phase. For 92 seconds, Nexari command routing at Kelt accepted only authenticated packets that had already been replaced by looped archives. Orders from Mitchell's bridge vanished into recursion. Sector commanders heard only stale triumphs and delayed acknowledgments. 92 seconds in a stable doctrine was survivable. 92 seconds in collapsing formation was terminal. Surrender vectors began lighting across the theater before Mitchell acknowledged the pattern. Iral Keth stared at the widening constellation of white surrender glyphs and spoke without ceremony. High Commander, the line is broken. Issue cessation. Preserve civilian hulls and surviving crews. Mitchell rounded on him. You would have me kneel to noise-trained animals. I would have you stop feeding ships into a solved trap, Iralketh said. Mitchell answered by opening his own mind into a wide-band compulsion pulse, trying to force compliance down his command chain through raw rank pressure. The pulse faltered. His network was no longer a network. Human operations teams had already cut junction relays by remote strike, and surviving Nexari nodes were too desynchronized to carry coherent command will. On the Bastion line, Special Operations Commander Talia Voss received the breach window. Target is Sovereign Clarity. Mesh severance confirmed. We board for command capture, not execution. Rhythm lock protocol live. Her assault teams launched in magnetized breaching pods under cover of lance fire that kept Nexari point defense pinned. Pods struck the flagship's dorsal spine, cut through armor collars, and deployed Marines into corridors lit by red emergency strips. Every human helmet carried an internal metronome pulse and a low vocal count. Left, right, breathe, move, decide. Nexari defenders attempted localized compulsion bursts at corners and choke points. The Marines felt the pressure hit like vertigo and kept stepping on count. Deck junction secure. Signal core cut. Bridge access in 12. Conclave observers, granted battlefield witness status, patched the assault feed into the chamber. Delegates who had once argued abstractions watched the war become legal fact. On Sovereign Clarity's bridge, Mitchell stood before a failing tactical sphere as his escort rings went dark one by one. Vereshtel's channel appeared briefly, fragmented by static. Hi, Commander. My remaining wing cannot hold left perimeter. Multiple units have surrendered. Request permission to... The transmission died beneath another cyber loop of Mitchell's own voice, promising inevitable human collapse. When the first shaped charge blew the bridge outer lock, Mitchell drew himself to full height and triggered one final, wideband compulsion burst aimed through the smoke and sparks of the breach. It slammed into the entering Marines and rolled over them like a psychic shock front. They staggered. They did not stop. Inside each helmet, the metronome clicked. Count held. Decision loops stayed intact. Commander Voss stepped through the breach with 2 squads fanned behind her, rifles trained center mass, but safeties still on controlled capture mode. Hi, Commander Mitchell. By Conclave Witness Authority and Terran Civilian Defense Statutes, you are under arrest for attacks on protected child and medical transports. Stand down. Mitchell's scales flared dark with rage. You are animals with lucky noise. The bridge doors behind Voss opened again, and Admiral Imani Reyes entered under escort, having transferred across once the flagship was ring-secured. She stopped 3 meters from Mitchell, voice level enough to cut glass. No, Commander. We are parents with long memories. For the first time since the crisis began, Mitchell looked less contemptuous than tired. He scanned the bridge displays, searching for one intact command avenue, one loyal wing still maneuvering, one proof that his hierarchy remained real. He found surrender glyphs, disabled hulls, and live observer feeds documenting every second. He tried to lunge for the command rail, perhaps to trigger scuttle, perhaps just to die issuing an order. Marine restraint lines snapped around his upper limbs and thoracic harness before he reached it. He fought with brutal strength for several breaths, then froze when Voss's second squad locked stasis cuffs around his neural control nodes. Do not humiliate me with the cage, he hissed. Reyes held his gaze. This is not humiliation. This is due process. She signaled the bridge recorder. Mark time. High Commander Mitchell captured alive at Kelt Narrows command bridge. Medical status stable, command authority terminated. Outside, resistance collapsed in waves. Nexari captains still capable of maneuver received 1 Terran transmission, repeated in 16 languages and 2 psionic carrier formats. Power down weapons, broadcast surrender vector, maintain life support, and you will be boarded safely. Most complied within minutes. Those that hesitated were disabled with the same surgical precision and then offered the same terms again. By the 20th minute after Mitchell's capture, coordinated Nexari fire had ceased. Reyes remained on the bridge long enough to ensure the next sequence was explicit and witnessed. Mitchell was searched under standardized protocol, scanned for concealed transmitters, medically assessed and transferred in full restraints to a secure Marine transport. Conclave legal observers confirmed identity biometrics in real time. No summary report could blur it later. The commander who had ordered schoolship occupations was alive, disarmed, and in custody. As he was led through the breach corridor, Mitchell turned once toward Reyes. Defiance still lived in his voice, but certainty had gone. You think this victory rewrites nature. Fear rules the lesser. Reyes answered without slowing. Fear visits everyone. What matters is who it serves. The transport hatch sealed behind him. Across Kelt, white surrender vectors multiplied until the tactical board looked like snowfall over dark water. Human rescue teams moved immediately, towing disabled Nexari hulls out of collision paths, stabilizing ruptured compartments, and routing medical aid to former attackers and protected convoys in the same priority matrix. It was triumph without frenzy, anger held inside law. On the Conclave feed, Sorensen watched the final confirmation packet appear beside the original 81-word warning, both entries now linked in permanent record. She exhaled once, then sent a short message to Reyes. Record complete. Children's corridors secured. Proceed to tribunals. Reyes read it on the captured flagship bridge while damage crews restored emergency lighting around her. Outside the viewport, the Narrows were full of drifting warships that could no longer threaten anyone. She turned to Commander Voss. Transmit theater-wide ceasefire compliance checks every 5 minutes. Begin prisoner processing under interstellar statute. No reprisals, no shortcuts. Voss nodded. Understood, Admiral. The battle for Kelt ended not with a final explosion, but with order reasserted under witness. The aggressor fleet broken, the commander captured alive, and the lanes to schools and clinics open again. The first distress call from a Nexari civilian ring arrived 22 minutes after coordinated fire ceased at Kelt. It came on an emergency channel the Nexari military had previously jammed for stability control, and the irony did not soften the numbers. Habitat Outer 7 had lost agricultural rotation after fortress reactors tripped offline. 2 medical decks were on backup power. Civilian transports were stacked in docking queues with no clearance authority because command staff had fled or been killed in secondary collisions. The call ended with a phrase translated into Terran Common by a trembling machine voice. Children are in dark compartments. Request assistance from any vessel. On the Bastion line, silence held for 3 breaths while officers watched the same species that had targeted school routes now asking for corridor mercy. A junior tactical officer spoke first, too quickly. Admiral, we can secure military surrender and leave civil relief to conclave agencies. If we divert now, we expose our boarding teams and logistics. Reyes kept her gaze on the distress overlay. Conclave agencies are 6 hours out at best. Outer 7 has 48 minutes before medical oxygen falls below safe pediatric thresholds. No one argued with the math. Someone still argued with the wound. They came for our children, another officer said, voice flat with restrained fury. Reyes answered without heat. Yes, which is why we do not become them. She opened a fleet-wide channel, military and civilian traffic both. All commands, this is Admiral Reyes. Nexari military resistance has ended. Nexari civilian distress at Outer 7 is verified. We are establishing humanitarian corridor under armed supervision. Rules are unchanged. Disarmament remains absolute. War crimes custody remains absolute. Aid is immediate. We do not answer threatened children by creating orphan worlds. On Resolute Finch, Hannah Bergman heard the order while supervising prisoner transfer manifests. She tapped her rail once, then looked to her civilian liaison, a teacher who had counted frightened crews through 2 corridor battles. You still good to run cadence clocks in docking chaos? The teacher gave a tired nod. If they can count, they can queue. If they can queue, nobody gets trampled. Then you're with me, Bergman said. Let's go be offensively responsible. Human Marines processed Nexari prisoners in the captured carrier bays under live conclave witness. Weapons were cataloged, tagged, and locked in transparent evidence crates. Wounded Nexari received treatment in triage lines that mixed uniforms without preference, except urgency. A Nexari boarding sergeant, arm fractured and eyes unfocused from failed compulsion backlash, recoiled when a Terran medic approached with a stabilizer splint. The medic crouched to eye level and spoke in formal trade tongue. I am treating the fracture. You are in custody. You are not in danger from me. The sergeant's jaw worked. Why? Because that is the law you violated, the medic said, and set the bone anyway. 2 decks above, Commander Talia Voss supervised transfer of High Commander Mitchell from temporary restraint to full tribunal-grade confinement. His thoracic harness, command filigree, and neural authority sigils were removed, scanned, and sealed in chain of custody cases marked Exhibit Prime. He watched each item disappear with a rigid stillness that looked like discipline and collapse at once. "You strip rank like skin," he said. Voss checked the biometric lock on the final case. "Rank is not skin. It is permission. Yours is revoked." By the time Bergman's relief group reached Outer 7, human tugs had already cleared 3 collision vectors and repressurized a children's ward whose lights had gone out mid-surgery. Nexari civilians pressed against viewport galleries, expecting retaliation broadcasts, spectacle, maybe selective rescue. They got Q officers, medics, and supply clerks with clipboards. A Nexari municipal administrator met Bergman at Dock Spine C, flanked by 2 shaking aides and 1 elderly theoretician she recognized from conclave briefs. Iral Keth inclined his head, old pride bent but not broken. "Lieutenant Commander Bergman, I submitted a private analytic cache to your legal teams 1 hour ago. It contains my objections to child-targeting doctrine and command edits that suppressed those objections." Bergman stared at him for a long second. "You kept receipts while serving the system." "I kept evidence when I failed to stop it," he said. "Use whichever verb your tribunal prefers." "Both," Bergman said. "Now show my engineers your failing air exchangers." 3 days passed before the first Interstellar War Tribunal hearing opened in the same conclave chamber where Mitchell had promised occupation. The white vaults carried less certainty now. Conclave observer tiers were full. Allied blocks that had once hedged sat in front rows with legal teams ready. The clerk called the case with ritual precision: deliberate attacks on protected civilian child and medical transports, unlawful compulsion use in diplomatic proceedings, and aggressive war under fabricated stabilization authority. Sorensen stood beside Omid Kader at the evidence rail while chain of custody crates glided into display fields 1 by 1. The original 81-word warning, time-stamped and acknowledged. Mitchell's unauthorized telepathic humiliation burst. Boarding orders for school halls issued before debate vote closure. Faresh Tell's field report requesting doctrinal correction and warning of civilian risk. Iral Keth's private cache showing command suppression annotations. The seized human educational relay, recovered intact from Nexari archive custody, its files verified and returned to Terran stewardship under witness. Every thread Mitchell had counted on being deniable became visible, dated, and linked. Mitchell declined council theater and spoke for himself. Even caged, he sounded like command. "You criminalize hierarchy because your species cannot bear disciplined superiority. I acted to prevent mimetic militarization of juveniles. History will vindicate necessity." Sorensen requested response, and the chamber granted it. "History already answered you at Kelt," she said. "Your doctrine identified children as leverage, then called the seizure protection. You were warned in plain language on record with legal citation and witnesses. You escalated anyway. Necessity is not a magic word that washes intent." The presiding panel withdrew for deliberation and returned in 41 minutes. The lead adjudicator read without flourish. "On all central counts guilty. Sentence: permanent confinement under interstellar high-security statute, lifetime command prohibition across recognized polities, mandatory archival access for historical education, no parole path. The record shall show the defendant captured alive, medically stabilized, lawfully tried, and confined." Mitchell stood as the restraint field brightened around him. He looked toward Reyes once, expression stripped to bone. "You think this makes you righteous?" Reyes met his stare. "No. It makes children harder to threaten." He was transferred that same hour to the Black Glass Custodial Array, a prison station without fleet access, where his cell faced inward to law texts and testimony records, not stars. By the second week of October, decommissioned teams were cutting Nexari harmonics arrays off war hulls, under joint inspection from Terran engineers Knoll auditors, and PAX insurers, who now treated undeclared armament as voided civil standing. Varish Tell, released from combat custody after full cooperation, appeared before a demilitarization board and accepted a civilian navigation post under monitored charter. He did not ask for honor restoration. He asked for school route maps and submitted corrected traffic models that reduced docking pileups on former military habitats. "I misread your songs," he told Bergman during one inspection shift. Bergman signed the handoff tablet. "So did half the galaxy. You're just one of the few who filed corrections before retirement." Within 3 years, the Lullaby Accords were ratified in full session, and this time, the chamber did not pretend neutrality where children were concerned. Sorensen, Reyes, and delegates from Lum, Knoll, PAX, and 27 former neutrals stood beneath the same white vaults while the clerk read the operative clauses aloud. Schools, nurseries, educational relays, and child evacuation routes were inviolable under collective defense. Any armed interference triggered automatic sanctions, corridor intervention authority, and war crimes review. Cultural memory archives were protected as civil continuity infrastructure, not suspect propaganda. Anti-coercion standards became mandatory for psychic and non-psychic forces alike. Cater submitted the final appendix himself, redacted archive lattice ethics language, including the line he had once questioned. "Procedure without ethics is efficient cruelty." No block objected. Kelt Station's mixed-species classroom opened on the Accord anniversary in a refurbished ring that had once housed Nexari boarding Marines. Now, the walls held route maps, emergency drills, and children's art in 6 scripts. Light from the station spine fell across the low tables where human, Nexari, Lum, and PAC students sat in a noisy semicircle around a teacher from Willow class and a former Nexari transit officer who now taught cooperative spacing. The lesson screen displayed a translated rhyme about counting safely before crossing a bridge. A small Nexari student raised a claw. "Is this a war song?" The human teacher shook her head. "It is a memory song. It helps you notice danger early, help the person next to you, and get everyone home." The former transit officer added, voice careful and steady, "And if someone powerful tells you safety requires obedience without question, you ask who benefits." At the back of the room, Reyes and Sorensen stood with no cameras, just 2 women who had carried warning and consequence to completion. Through the viewport beyond the class, civilian convoys moved through the narrows in calm, staggered lines, escorted by multinational patrols operating on shared anti-coercion protocols. No fortress guns tracked them. No boarding orders waited behind legal euphemisms. Children clapped a 4-beat count and laughed when they lost tempo, then started again together until everyone matched.